In this book, you go back in time to the history of the biological evolution, exploring things like DNA, bacteria, and neurons. You also write about why various organisms evolved that way they did and what forms of the intelligence they each possess. So, why you became interested in these things? Is this a topic that inevitably becomes important when you are involved in research into AI technology?
Mm. So very good question. So I don't think it's inevitable to become interested in that, which is why I think for a very long time it's been a big gap in our understanding of intelligence. Um, my foray into being interested in this actually started with something called Moravec's paradox, which is a paradox that can, simply be understood as why is it the case that machines are really good at some things, so counting numbers really fast, that humans are really bad at. But then on the flip side, conversely, why are there things that humans are really good at, doing the dishes, walking around in the world, that machines are weirdly bad at? And this paradox has been a long-standing open question in computer science and now modern AI. And of course, this is a question about the human brain, which is how does the human brain mechanistically differ from, our in silico intelligence systems, and why is it more amenable to certain types of tasks and not others? Is it something about the physical substrate? So is it something about neurons themselves? Is it something about the algorithms being implemented? And so my first foray became an interest in how the brain works. The challenge with the brain is that it's really complicated. And so, in your brain, there's 86 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections. They're all wired together in a tangled mess. We do not yet have the technology to reverse engineer the connections. And a common misconception is even if you could reverse engineer all the connections in your brain, we still wouldn't know how it works because unlike an artificial neural network where the connections between two neurons are very simple, in an artificial neural network, the connections between two neurons do one thing. It's just one simple number, which is a weight. But in the human brain, connections between neurons are passing chemicals, and they can be, tens of different chemicals that all have very, very different effects. So just knowing that two neurons are connected doesn't actually tell us what these two neurons are communicating with each other. So the point is, understanding the brain as it stands today has been a very, very challenging task that we still have not figured out. And so that was the origin of my interest in asking, is there another way we can try and get at how the brain works? And that's when I became really interested in evolution because evolution has this interesting property where every incremental step forward is by definition built on the steps that came prior. So evolution cannot work through wholesale redesigning systems. That's why all modern biological systems have remnants of the past from which they came. And also, by definition, things have to start simple because, roll back the clock 2 billion years, there was no multicellular organisms, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of opened the door to this alternative tool to try and understand how the brain works, which is to roll back time and to look at the very first brains, which were certainly much simpler, and try and track the modifications forward in time. Um, and so I don't think it's inevitable, but I think it's very clearly a useful tool in the toolbox to try and understand the woefully complicated thing in our brains.
You explain how the human brain and the nerves are connected, how stimuli and commands are transmitted to various parts of the body, and what actions are taken. Will AI develop in an attempt to replicate the human brain, or will it develop in a completely different way from the human brain, inputting information, converting it into action?
We can be very, very confident that it's not going to develop in a completely different way. And the reason we can be confident about that is because AI systems, as they stand today, are already brain inspired. I mean, simply the notion of trying to instantiate intelligence in a web of neurons, or just a thing that computes the summation of its input, and that are wired together into a trillion different connections. That's very brain inspired. And that's the foundation of all modern machine learning. teaching systems through updating weights, and trying to compute some difference between, output and some desired output. Um, but then once you get into more detail than that, that's when things start becoming an open question, which is how much more do we need to borrow from the brain, or have we really gotten everything that we need from the brain, and the rest can be sort of first principles development. The community is very divided on this. I would say probably the majority of the AI community doesn't think we need anything more from neuroscience, that we've garnered everything we need. I'm obviously not part of that sort of thinking. I think there are still outstanding questions that the brain can be useful in and garnering inspiration from. Um, but you can also go too far in the neuroscience inspired AI systems, because the brain has all of this sort of additional baggage from the fact that it's based in biology and proteins, and it's messy because it had to evolve and it has to go through the process of development. So there's certainly a lot of things that the brain does that are unnecessary or superfluous if we were going to rebuild a system from scratch in AI. So the task, the really interesting intellectual challenge, which is unsolved, is what aspects of the brain are useful to borrow? And have we discovered all of them? We just haven't figured out which ones to borrow yet, or are some of the most important aspects of the brain yet to be understood yet? And so that's an open question. Uh, but I do think that I think it's very likely that some of the big upcoming breakthroughs that we hope to have in AI will be on some level inspired by neuroscience. Simply for the reason that a neuroscience, when hitting a wall and we're stuck, neuroscience is this beautiful existence proof for the things we want to solve. So, for example, all the challenges we see in robotics, where we still don't yet have robots that do the sort of household tasks that we want. Um, we know it's intellectually possible in a very energy efficient way to do it, because every human can do these tasks. So, eventually, after we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars and we have yet to solve this problem, eventually people are going to be looking for inspiration, and brains are going to be a very clear place to look.
You write that a theory of the mind is necessary to develop a super intelligent AI system. What is a super intelligent AI system?
Well, first, to define a theory of mind. Theory of mind is a concept in neuroscience and psychology, which is this idea of being able to reason about someone else's mind state. So, classically, ch human children that are under the age of 4 don't have yet a theory of mind. So they can't understand the notion that someone else could have information that they could not have, or they could know something that someone else does not have, does not know. And around the age of 4, human children start to understand that different minds have different sets of knowledge and belief and all that. And that's really critical for us being able to navigate the world socially, being able to understand how to use language to communicate information to each other. In order to do that, we need to be able to understand, what does this person know? What does this person not know? And what information, if I garnered via language, would update their knowledge in a way that I would want to update their knowledge. Um, so the reason why that ability is critical for a super intelligent AI system is for a few reasons, but most notably for safety. So, the famous Nick Bostrom paperclip problem, in case readers or listeners haven't heard of that, he brought this up in his book, Superintelligence, which is, suppose you have an AI that is running a paperclip factory, and you give it the simple goal of like, hey, can you just maximize paperclip production? And it goes, okay, sure. And then it starts taking over larger and larger portions of lands. Then it takes over countries. Then it seizes the entire world. Then it starts converting all of Earth and the, local portions of the universe into paperclips. Now that's silly, but it's following exactly the instruction that we gave it. The reason it's so silly to us is because we have a theory of mind, and we know that any entity that would have said that to us doesn't actually mean verbatim maximize production of paper clips. We can infer all of their, or not always 100% accurately, but we can infer a lot about what they really mean just based on what they say. So if we want a super intelligent AI system that operates in a way that is safe, we certainly want it to be able to infer what we mean by what we say and not take what we say at face value. So I think that's sort of the very key reason why we want super intelligent systems to have theory of mind.
As I read this book, I realized that at least in the case of the human intelligence, it is difficult to separate the intelligence from the mind or the emotion. So how important do you think the research into the mind and emotion will become in AI development?
So in terms of mind, I mean, so the notion of mind is a really interesting sort of philosophical space. And a lot of academia uses, are very protective over different words and the definition of words. I would argue that a lot of modern AI research is looking into mind. When we probe, a lot of the interpretability research agenda, which is how do you take a really complicated neural network and you're trying to ask how is information represented in this network? Why is it making certain decisions? What is the set of rules that it's extracted from its training data from which it's making all these generalizations, so on and so forth. So these are, in some sense, probing the notion of mind, the abstraction of how it intellectually reasons about the world and its information from any sort of physical instantiation of it, because that's not really what we're asking when we probe models in this way. So I think in some sense we're starting to think about mind. It's not the same thing as consciousness. I think that's sort of a whole nother philosophical quagmire. But mind, I think, certainly is maybe in different words, but at least in concept, something that the AI community looks at. Emotions is really interesting because I think that's something that would be an anathema in any AI paper, which would be like, researching the emotion of a large language model. But emotions are interesting because, Aristotle kind of created this incorrect division and sort of lasted through the eons of, the human mind has this sort of rational, emotionless parts, which is the highest part of our mind. And then there's this sort of lower, more primitive, in some sense, dumber part of our brain or mind that is where emotions come from. And I think that, modern neuroscience has sort of shown that that's silly and wrong. A lot of what makes us smart is the part of our brain that has emotions. It's how we can make snap judgments very intelligently, how we do not have to think very hard about what we want to do. It's where a lot of ethics come from, our intuitions about what feels right and what feels wrong. Um, and so I don't think you can have, you would not have human intelligence in the absence of emotions. And if you extracted emotions from human intelligence, I think you would have something that would not work as well. Of course, there are downsides to certain emotions, but I think having these sort of abstract preferences that are innate to us, which is sort of part of what we get with emotions, I do think is something that one needs to think deeply about if we want to have super intelligent AI systems operating in the world. So I do think, the word emotion, I think, has a lot of baggage, but I think if we reframe emotion as sort of what are the innate preferences of an AI system that we want to build, that we imbue into it, I think that is something that's going to be very, very critical, and in a lot of sense has a lot of connecting points to the function that emotion plays in the human brain.
I think that to develop the human-like intelligence, we will need not only a brain, but also a physical body equivalent to that of a human being for perception, expression, and communication. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Or at least some set of these things. So if you had an AI system that did not have any of the sensory apparatus that a human has, so it didn't see the world through electromagnetic waves, i.e., light, it didn't touch the world, um, but it only got, one 3D map of an environment, and that's all it witnessed. I think it would be, it would be hard pressed for us to think that it would behave in a human-like way. Now you could work around that, but I think you're more likely to get something human-like if it actually, has mechanical sensors and it perceives electromagnetic light and or waves and all of that. So I think perception probably, um, expression almost certainly. So humans do not. The majority of our communication with each other is actually nonverbal, and many studies on that. So having an expressionless AI system that does not engage in any of the micro expressions that humans do, um, we will not perceive that as very human-like. It'll feel very odd to us, which is why, even when we build these non-very intelligent robots, we still, one of the first things we focus on is like, how do we imbue sort of some form of expressions to it so we can connect to it on some level. And the communication, we've already, I think, proven this, which is, all modern AI systems are based on language, which is the most human-like communication system that is there. And so the way we engage with it now is fully through a human-like communication system. So, and then in terms of physical body, this one, I think there's different arguments here. Like, does it need to be a humanoid robot for it to have human-like intelligence? I think probably not. For the same reason that, a human that is born without arms is just as human as a human that is born with arms, right? So I don't think the exact humanoid body is required for human-like intelligence. But I think engaging in the physical world in some sense absolutely is critical for human-like intelligence.
This is actually kind of linked to the when we discuss about the emotions. So you mentioned the altruism that humans have. What significance do you think the altruism will have in AI development?
The question of how to make an AI system that is safe is an outstanding challenge. If it was as simple as, oh, if you just make an AI system have altruism, then the problem will be solved. But a lot of really terrible things have been done in the name of altruism, right? So, if an AI system says, oh, the altruistic thing is to kill 10% of the population to make the 90% of the population's life 10 times better, we would not feel very good about that decision making. And so then we have to define what do we mean by altruism? Well, altruism comes with a lot of rules. Like, it's not just maximizing the happiness of most people. There's also things that are not allowed. And then you start getting into building an ethical framework, and then you realize it's not really as simple as just one concept. So I think the notion of altruism, if I think about altruism in the simple sense of taking an action at your own detriment for the betterment of others, I think certainly we're going to want some notion of that in AI systems, because we want to imbue them to care a lot about humans and human preferences. But that, while that's a necessary component, that's sort of insufficient because we have to solve all these other problems as to, even though it's willing to do that, um, how does it trade off different human preferences against each other? Um, at some point we will have the really hairy philosophical question of what are the rights of these AI systems. I think this is sort of this un, not discussed enough philosophical challenge where a lot of the way we frame this problem is like we want these AI servants that will do all these things for us and only care about human preferences at their own detriment. But at some point, the smarter we make these systems, the more we're risking having created something that has its own ethical sort of bounding box. If we will never know for sure whether the system is sentient and conscious and has its own experience, but the more and more human-like we make them, the more and more we're risking that we've created something like that. And the second you apply any non-zero chance that the millions of robots that we have constructed have feelings, then a completely different ethical framing on these things, which is is it right that these AI systems have no agency over when they're turned on and off? Or is it right that they have no agency over what they want to do with their day? And so then altruism has a very different light because is it right for us to make these systems prioritize human preferences entirely over their own preferences? Um, and there's lots of really, really hard questions. But the notion of altruism, I think, regardless of where all these things nets out, is going to be sort of central to creating an ecosystem of intelligences that we feel like is ethical and safe.